Chapter 27 is called The Great Break, War and Revolution, and the subject matter of this chapter is really World War I and the Russian Revolution, which are two of the most interesting topics all year, and really they set up the 20th century as the century of incredible violence and conflict on a massive scale that the world had never known before. One of the more interesting things about World War I really from right now is that it was 100 years ago right now. It started in the late part of 1914 and went all the way through to 1918, and we're really at the 100th anniversary of all of that right now. So there's lots of articles out online, and there's a BBC website that you may want to take a look at that is dedicated to the 100th anniversary and really the memory of World War I. Great topic. So let's get right into the notes here. Section 1, the First World War, the Bismarckian system of alliances. So this story picks up in 1871, right after Germany became a unified nation, and it's being led at the time by Otto von Bismarck, the guy that we learned so much about in chapter 25. So starting as soon as Germany was unified, they were very much a satisfied power, which means that they no longer had aggression or ambitions in Europe. They didn't want any more territory. They were very happy. France had been defeated quite dramatically in the Franco-Prussian War. And so even though everyone else was shocked at how quickly Germany unified, they were relatively happy and no longer interested in expansion. On the other hand, what they were concerned about was keeping their big enemy, the French, isolated and without allies. So Bismarck is a skilled politician. He's a master manipulator of the situation. And I'll just show you the map right here. So this is what we've got going. Germany's huge, right? They've got massive territory in North Central Europe. But again, their enemy is France, who they just defeated, and they want to keep the French in check. They also were very concerned about Eastern Europe, which we're going to see that's where the war started. They were concerned about Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was crumbling, and they were also concerned about Russia, which was not modernizing. They were concerned about the Ottoman Empire, which was also being destroyed by nationalism and falling apart due to the forces of nationalism again. The Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe. It was in such disarray, and they're withdrawing from the Balkan Peninsula toward modern-day Turkey. And none of those big empires are going to make it through World War I. The Russians, the Austrians, and the Ottomans are all going to be destroyed one way or another through World War I. So Bismarck has a great idea that we've got to make alliances, and he comes up with several versions of these alliances to try to basically keep the French out of any significant place in Europe. And Germany wanted to be the leader of all of these alliances, of course. So there's the Three Emperors League. There's Bismarck, our friend. Here's the Three Emperors League: Austria, Germany, and Russia. And I want you to stop here and look at this cartoon and try to figure out who's who of the three and who's pulling the strings of the Three Emperors League. All right? And the next one, which was about a decade later, was known as the Triple Alliance. This one's the most important one. This is the one that's going to lead into World War I. It's Austria, Italy, and Germany. Okay, so the point on these alliances is that they're shifting. They change. The Russians come and go sometimes. The Italians have come and gone. But Austria and Germany become the two forces that unite together. They both speak German. They have a similar culture. There's a lot, even though they've had wars in the past, there was a lot of reasons for them to stay in an alliance together. So they're shifting alliances, but they work. Bismarck is Machiavellian. He knows how to, be friends with you one day and turn on you the next in order to keep Germany secure. So the ultimate result of all this was that Germany was really the leader in European affairs. They were the mastermind of all of these foreign different policies, and people looked to Germany as one of the strongest nations in the continent at the time. They had a really strong 19th century at least. This kept the peace in Europe. There weren't any major wars after the Germans stopped their war against France in 1871. On to page 2. The point on section B, the rival blocks, is that the alliances start to break down. And one of the main things that happens that causes this is that Otto von Bismarck was fired as Chancellor of Germany by a new king, a new Kaiser named Wilhelm II. This guy was very young, he was very brash, he was very arrogant, and he thought he didn't need this old man who had a lot more respect than he did controlling German affairs. He was ready to be the man the king of Germany and do it himself. So this was a very impetuous young man, Kaiser William II. This guy's going to draw Germany into the war. So these alliances break down. The Russians start to get very concerned about Germany because of the new Kaiser, and as a result, they start to draw closer to France as opposed to Germany. So there's an increasing hostility between the Germans and the Russians at this point. There's also an increasing conflict because of the Kaiser's policies between Britain and Germany. And Britain was the economic leader of Europe, but they weren't really the military leader of Europe at the time. They were happy in their what was known as their splendid isolation. They really didn't have any permanent allies at the time, and they were fine with that. They didn't want to get entangled in European affairs like they're going to be so many times in the 20th century. And this is, of course, natural because they're an island off the coast of Europe and they don't really see themselves as European. They're English. Whereas the Germans are surrounded by people in Europe and they needed those alliances to secure their peace. There's a growing commercial rivalry, which means business, trade, colonies, markets, the search, raw materials. This is all what's going on between Germany and Britain. But maybe even more important, there was a growing naval rivalry, a military rivalry, but specifically the building of a navy. And we'll get to that more here in just a minute. So what happens is we have new versions of alliances that start to form. There's the dismissal of Bismarck. It was called dropping the pilot. This was the phrase that gets associated with William II's firing of Otto von Bismarck, is that you've kicked out the pilot of the ship, and now where are we going? And there's the Kaiser up there, and there's Bismarck descending the staircase, and now we've got a sort of a rudderless ship of Germany that everyone was concerned about. Here's another cartoon that is very famous with the dismissal of Bismarck in 1890. You can see the Kaiser on his little throne of cannonballs and all kinds of crazy things there. There's a little doll he's holding that's made up of a bomb and dynamite for arms and legs. And meanwhile, that woman in the back represents the future peace of Europe and Germany and what's going to happen now that the master-minded politician Bismarck is out and the young Kaiser is in. So as a response to all this new aggression, there's new alliances formed, and this one's kind of important, the Entente Cordiale. It's an alliance between England and France. Later on, it's going to be known as the Triple Entente. It's going to include Russia. Now, this really bothers the Germans. Now they start to see that there's a rival bloc to them, to their version, their Triple Alliance. All right, so the Algeciras Conference. This is Germany's effort to get some territory in Africa. They're protesting the French takeover of Morocco, which is one of the main French colonies in North Africa. And Germany, as a new rising world power led by the Kaiser, sort of bullied the other countries of Europe into this meeting. It's an international meeting, and the Germans are very aggressive, and they're trying to stop the French from expanding, except they're doing it not in a really diplomatic way, they're doing it in a very threatening way. And the end result of this conference was that all of the European countries agreed that France would actually get Morocco as a colony and that Germany would get nothing. And they were angry at them for calling this meeting and wasting everyone's time. So Germany emerges as a threat, and the leadership of Germany was really angry because they got nothing out of this meeting, and everyone else in Europe is just now afraid of them more and more. So here we go, back to the German naval buildup. This is the main source of tension between England and Germany at the time. It's led by Admiral von Tirpitz, who's the leader of the new German Navy. Germany didn't have a navy until this point. They were not even a nation until 1871. And this is they thought that to be a great power in Europe, you had to have a navy. But England had the biggest navy in Europe at the time, and they didn't really want anyone else to have a navy because that's their role. Their empire is all around the world, and they patrol the seas, and this is their thing. But now the Germans want a piece of that action. Journalists don't help this naval rivalry any at all. They are hyping it. They're publishing fanatical articles and editorials that really demonize one another, both on the German and English side, to the point that you have, in the turn of the century, 1900, really a hysterical relationship and situation between Germany and Britain, almost a love-hate relationship. They really respected each other, knowing that they each were a great economic and military power, but then they were terribly afraid of each other too. And so I guess the thing you could write down at the bottom of this page is that the result of all of this breakdown of alliances over the century, over the later part of the 19th century, after Bismarck was fired, was that Germany and Austria became isolated. They're it. By the time we start World War I, they're the only people that like each other. And everyone else has been alienated by Germany, alienated by the Kaiser, and they've all drifted toward each other and away from Austria and Germany. Over to page 3, the outbreak of war. So the war began in the Balkan Peninsula, which is down by Greece. Take a look at this cartoon. This is a cartoon known as the powder keg of Europe, or this is the phrase that gets associated with the Balkan Peninsula. There was lots of trouble in the Balkans, lots of conflict. And this is, of course, where the war is going to explode. And you just want to be able to identify the caricatures in this little cartoon of each of the major powers of Europe as they tried to sit on the cauldron of the Balkan Peninsula as it bubbled over and boiled over, and these guys are trying their best to keep it under control, and of course that's going to be unsuccessful. Nationalism is destroying empires. This is what's going on in the Balkan Peninsula. The Ottoman Empire, much like the Austrian Empire, is being taken apart by different rebellions of people that want their own nation. Basically, this is huge. So as the Ottoman Empire withdraws from Europe because of the role of nationalism among these other nations, like Serbia particularly, there's going to be a whole bunch of wars that go on there that the rest of Europe is going to get involved in, and that's going to lead to the First World War. The Congress and Treaty of Berlin is different from the Congress of Berlin that we learned about in chapter 26 that dealt with how the Europeans were going to cut up Africa. This is a different Congress and meeting in Berlin called by Bismarck, actually, before he was dismissed, to try to deal with some of these troubles in the Balkans, knowing that the place was very unstable, the region was very unstable, and the Europeans did not want to see that continue. They wanted to replace the leadership of the Ottoman Empire with European leadership and really not give a lot of independent nations their freedom. So the main outcome of that meeting in 1878 was that Austria was given the right to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a territory in the Balkans that the Ottoman Empire used to control. Occupy means the army's going to be there to protect it and stabilize it, but they don't really control it politically. Another outcome of that meeting was that Serbia and Romania were going to be independent. I'm going to go back to the map here. There it is, so we can see it. So the Ottoman Empire, again, is modern-day Turkey, but at the time they had ruled all of the Balkans. So Serbia is independent, Romania is independent, but you can't even actually see on that map, you can't actually see Bosnia. Let me see if I can find one that does. Yeah, sort of. If you see the city of Sarajevo on this map, that's the capital of Bosnia. So this is a map after Austria was given the right to occupy that territory of Bosnia. The problem in this whole situation is that Serbia, as a newly independent nation, was really wanting to be the leader of the Balkans, the leader of that area. They wanted to expand. There was a lot of nationalists in Serbia, and they wanted a greater kingdom of Serbia that they controlled. They wanted to take over Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia, maybe even Bulgaria. They were open to taking over the whole thing. It was called Pan-Slavism. That's a key term, Pan-Slavism, P-A-N-S-L-A-V-I-S-M. They wanted to be the leader of all the Slavic people in the Balkans. The Slavic is their nationality, their ethnic group. All of the people in the Balkans, except the Greeks, are Slavic. So the Serbians wanted to expand, and they looked mainly to Russia for help. Serbia can't do any of this on their own. They need the help of a large empire, and they're going to go to Russia for help. Russia is also Slavic. So there's a relationship. They're like ethnic cousins. The Serbians and everyone in the Balkans with Russia, they're kind of related in their culture, religion, and heritage and all of that. It doesn't help that in 1908, Austria just full-on annexed Bosnia, which means they took it over politically and began to run it like a colony. The Serbians are outraged by this, but they can't do a whole lot because Austria is pretty powerful. There's a series of wars known as the Balkan Wars right before World War I, where the Serbians are attacking people around them, not Austria, to try to expand their territory and further kick the Ottomans out of Europe. And they did. So the Ottoman Empire by 1913 is basically restricted to where it is today, which is modern-day Turkey. And of course, they're going to be involved in World War I, and the Ottoman Empire is going to fall and be replaced by the country of Turkey. So that's the background to all of this. Moving forward a little bit, basically, by the time we hit 1914, the thing is going to come to a big trouble. Here's a picture of a political cartoon of the trouble in the Balkans. You see the Ottoman Empire on the right with the fez. He's sick, he's choking, and he's stepping away from the map of Europe, stepping away from Turkey. And then we've got the two people fighting over what's left. The Austrians on the left with the funny mop hat pulling on Bosnia to try to take that over, and then the Russians in the middle trying to exercise their influence with Serbia and Bulgaria, pulling on that. It's a great cartoon. So the one moderate in the whole thing actually was Archduke Franz Ferdinand of of Austria-Hungary. He's the heir to the throne. He's not a bad guy. He was actually someone that was a political moderate who was very concerned about what was going on in the Balkans, and his visit down to Sarajevo in Bosnia was actually an effort to make peace and calm some of the anger in that area against the Austrian Empire. His father, the Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, was firmly committed to imperialism and expansion and believed Austria needed to conquer the Balkans. But Franz Ferdinand, being a younger, more modern man, was aware that the Austrian Empire was crumbling and that maybe this wasn't the solution was simply taking over more territory. So his visit to Sarajevo was a goodwill visit, ironically, and the best chance maybe of preventing war would have been with Franz Ferdinand. And sadly, as it often is in history, it's the moderate that gets taken out of the picture and the extremists are left. So he went to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, in June of 1914 to make peace. And he goes on a walk through the city without a whole lot of security. This reminds me a lot of the JFK assassination. He and his wife went on they went on a motorcade in an open-topped car, a convertible, and waiting for them in the streets of Sarajevo was a group of men called the Black Hand, who was a Serbian nationalist society. These are terrorists, essentially, who had crossed the border into Bosnia from Serbia in an effort to disrupt the future of that area and really make it a Serbian-dominated region. And these are assassins, and there was a lot of complicated plots. There were like a dozen guys or so that were waiting for these. They were staked out all over the city at different locations. There were several attempts to assassinate Archduke Ferdinand throughout the day. At one point, one of the guys threw a grenade into his car, and the Archduke basically caught it and threw it back at the guy that threw it to him, and it blew up and it injured the would-be assassin. So this was a crazy day, and yet they continued on with their tour of the city. The last part of the day, he was actually headed out of the city and to where he was staying, the Archduke, and their car made a wrong turn down an alley. And waiting for him, actually the guy that killed him was in a delicatessen eating a sandwich at the time, and he thought he had missed his chance to shoot the Archduke. And then this car comes down the street unexpectedly, gets stuck in an alley, he's trying to turn around, and he comes out with a clear shot, eating a sandwich at the time. So it's a really interesting story. You should look it up. So here it is. This is a famous sketch of the assassination of the Archduke and his wife. So they shoot both the Archduke and his wife. Huge turning point in world affairs. At this point, the Austrians are outraged. Here's the assassin, Gavrilo Princip, young man. I think he was not even 20 years old. Okay, very short little guy that wanted to be a hero for his people, the Serbs. Austria goes crazy. They issue an ultimatum to Serbia that says basically let Austria-Hungary come in and control Serbia as punishment for the murder of the Archduke. The Austrians fully blamed Serbia, even though it was sort of a renegade terrorist group within Serbia that committed the act. So this is a similar situation to us today when we deal with terrorism. Is it the country that the terrorists are in our enemy, or is it the terrorist groups themselves? And we have lots of debate over that politically, very similar to 1914. The July crisis starts when Austria mobilizes their army and declares war on Serbia for having, allegedly, the Serbians, they thought the whole nation was behind the assassination. This is the first step in a series of actions to start World War I, July 28th, 1914. Germany, now Austria wouldn't have done that without a little backing, and so they went to Germany first and said, what if we attack Serbia? What do you think? And the Germans gave them what was known as a blank check, unconditional support. Anything that you need, Austria, as our ally, we will give you. Now this starts to unravel the whole system of alliances. Russia knows that this is happening, and Russia pledges support to Serbia in this whole conflict. So it's like a fight, and everyone jumps in and backs their friend. Turn to page 4. The war starts to expand. Alliances, timetables, battle plans that have been in place for decades kicked into action. The Russians, worried about what the Germans and Austrians were doing, started to mobilize their army against Austria and Germany. And they fully mobilized, which means they sent troops to the borders of those two empires to try to stop the action. I'm going to go back to the map here. This is always helpful. There we go. So Russia sends troops to Germany. Russia sends troops to Austria. The Germans at the time had an amazing, crazy battle plan called the Schlieffen Plan, which said, if we ever fight in Europe, we're going to have a two-front war. You can see that. They're going to have Russia as the enemy, France as the enemy. Even though France has nothing to do with this at this point, the battle plan for Germany called to attack France first, knock them out, and then go to Russia. This is known as the famous Schlieffen Plan. And this is what they do. Once they were intimidated by Russia's mobilization, they considered that an act of war. The Germans invaded France, which is just bizarre. And they didn't just flat out invade France. They invaded France by going through Belgium. And Belgium is not even in these alliances. Belgium was neutral. And this was an act of international war, essentially, a crime against the international community to invade a neutral country. They invaded Belgium because the French army was sitting in Alsace-Lorraine, or next to that, right on the border between the orange and the purple, between France and Germany. The army was waiting there, so instead the Germans went through a neutral country where they could easily attack where the army wasn't there. So it was a crazy plan. This really sets things off. I'll show you a picture. Here's the Schlieffen Plan. To invade Belgium, sweep down, knock out Paris, and then head east and fight Russia. So Britain declared war on Germany after they invaded Belgium, because that was sort of the last stake in the whole thing. You can't invade a neutral country. That's an act of war. Now the battle plans are in gear, the alliances are at war, and we're in World War I. Something very obscure in the southern part of Europe started a major world war. So the reflections on the origins of the war. Austria's role, well, they deliberately started the war against Serbia as punishment for all of this. And you got to take that into account. They didn't go after the terrorist group itself. They went after the nation that the group was from. There's always questions there. Germany certainly has a huge role in the war. They backed Austria, the blank check. They invaded France. Somewhat, France was not even really part of the scene until this point. So you got to study this little picture here. This is very helpful to see who blamed who for what. Meanwhile, the peace of Europe is dead at the time. People often ask, why was Germany so aggressive? Well, they felt isolated because they weren't part of the Triple Entente. They felt like people were ganging up on them. The failure of the international system was basically, that means that Germany crumbled after Bismarck was fired. They were no longer really welcome in Europe. The Kaiser was so aggressive. They lost their friends and alliances at that point. Another theory on why the Germans were so willing to go to war and back Austria and invade France was that there were a lot of domestic conflicts at home. There was the rising socialist movement led by a woman named Rosa Luxemburg, and perhaps the leaders of Germany were using war to distract people, to rally the masses, to sort of suppress the socialist movement. There's lots of theories on why Germany was so aggressive. The role of nationalism can't be ignored here. Germans were incredibly nationalistic and ready to fight. Serbians were nationalistic and wanting to dominate the Balkans as the leader, the natural leader there. The arms race can't be ignored between Britain and France, particularly. We call that militarism. Particularly the naval race between those two nations. And basically, everyone was ready for war. By the time we hit 1914, most European countries were eager to fight, one reason or another. A lot of social Darwinism was present in people's beliefs that, particularly in Germany, that they believed they were the superior race, that it was their destiny to fight and conquer other nations. They'd done it in Africa and Asia, but now it's time to do it in the continent of Europe itself. So the celebrations, people reacted with incredible excitement and celebration. This is war celebrations in Munich, Germany in 1914. Look who's in the crowd, ready to go fight for Germany and Austria at that time. A really ominous picture. People thought the war would be over within a few months. They had no idea it was going to go on for 4 years. They had no idea it would lead to the destruction of empires. They were eager for a fight. Sort of a very ominous, cryptic scene in most parts of Europe at this point. One last note, kind of interesting, is that all of the major leaders of World War I were related. The Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia were first cousins. They all were related through Queen Victoria of England, actually, who was their grandmother. The King of England was the first cousin of the Tsar of Russia. These guys look like brothers. All of these royalty were in one big extended family, and that adds one more element to the drama surrounding the First World War.